Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. President. 480. That is the number of days since terror shook the Middle East. It's been 480 days since Hamas's unprovoked attack. 480 days since Hamas brought brutal terror on Israel and the citizens of more than 30 countries. 480 days since American family members and friends were kidnapped. Last year, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his former defense minister. The illegitimate court, which acts as prosecutor, jury, and judge, brought politically motivated charges for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. Since when did self-defense in the face of terrorist attacks and atrocities become a war crime? The ICC has forgotten too quickly who started this war, who turned a music festival into a graveyard, who attacked, unprovoked, bringing devastating carnage on defenseless victims. The ICC has forgotten the 7 Americans still in Gaza, our fellow countrymen and women. They have forgotten the remains of the innocent Hamas victims that Hamas keeps, the hostages, even in death. They have forgotten the corpses in the streets, the babies and the soldiers beheaded, the people burned alive in their cars. They have forgotten the doors riddled with bullet holes, the ground stained with blood, the smell of decaying flesh. The ICC has forgotten the hell Hamas inflicted on Israel and many other nations, and instead it vilifies a nation seeking justice and the chance to live in peace. This is not surprising. From the beginning, the United States has rejected this body. From President Clinton to President Trump, every president, Democrat and Republican, has never recognized the ICC's jurisdiction over our nation. In fact, no president has even submitted the Rome Statute establishing the ICC to the Senate for advice and consent. We have never ratified it. And why? Because entrusting an international governing body with authority over U.S. citizens risks undermining the very freedoms and sovereignty that define this nation. The ICC has repeatedly sought to impose its authority over the U.S. and over our allies. And now it has alleged that Israel has committed war crimes. Meanwhile, the tribunal conveniently turns a blind eye to atrocities in China, hiding behind the excuse of non-membership, despite the fact that neither the United States nor Israel are members. The hypocrisy of the ICC is breathtaking. Well, enough is enough. Earlier this month, the House passed the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act on a bipartisan basis. And I am deeply, deeply disappointed that my Democratic colleagues who voted against moving forward on this legislation did that here in the United States Senate. I sincerely hope that they reconsider. Our sovereignty is non-negotiable. Allowing the ICC to operate unchecked and without consequence grants them authority where they should have none. Worse, it sets a standard that encourages repetition. We have a responsibility to protect the sovereignty of our nation and our allies. This moment, it demands courage and it demands conviction, and we must rise to meet it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The other senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to talk about the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act that we voted on earlier in this chamber. The International Criminal Court was created to hold accountable war criminals, for example, in countries that did not have a system of justice, did not have the rule of law, and were incapable of holding those people accountable. In 2020, the International Criminal Court started investigating American soldiers' actions. This despite the fact that we have a system of justice. We are governed by the rule of law. As my senior senator from Nebraska just pointed out, we're not a signatory to the ICC. We're not a part of that international organization. Last year, the International Criminal Court indicted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel has the rule of law. Israel has a system of justice. And Israel is not a signatory to the ICC. And yet, they indicted him. The International Criminal Court is out of control. It's a rogue international organization. And when they indicted Prime Minister Netanyahu, what they did is they put a moral equivalency between Israel's actions to defend itself and the barbaric attacks Hamas perpetrated on October 7th. Let's be clear here. When Hamas launched their terror attack on Israel, they were targeting civilians. That is a war crime. When Israel responds back to defend itself, civilians are going to get hurt in war, but that's not who Israel was targeting. They were targeting the terrorists who attacked them. That's legitimate. The International Criminal Court destroyed whatever shred of credibility they had when they made that indictment. And if they are coming after the Israeli Prime Minister, it won't be long before they start coming after American troops. In fact, the Wall Street Journal had an article that said, if the International Criminal Court issues arrest warrants for Israelis, Americans are likely to follow. This organization is a failure. Despite its $187 million budget, it has not been able to bring to justice dictators around the world. They've done very little. Again, my senior senator mentioned China, but they haven't done anything to stop Vladimir Putin. They haven't done anything against Iran's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. They haven't done anything against North Korea's Kim Jong-un. And yet they are targeting countries that have a system of justice and rule of law. That is not why this organization was supposed to have been created. The ICC is a lawless, politicized international organization that is threatening our sovereignty. This requires a strong response on our part. The Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act was that strong response. It would have directed the president within 60 days to launch sanctions against foreign nationals who were involved with the malign activities of the ICC, to target our American troops or our allies, for example. We need to have a strong response back to protect our sovereignty. When we're talking about, for example, sanctions, we're talking about assets, freezing assets of those foreign nationals or travel bans. It would have sent a strong message to all of those foreigners who were trying to target us or our allies. Sadly, the Democrats voted down this important bill that would have sent a strong message. Their arguments were specious, frivolous, meaningless. The Democrats said, well, this bill targets our allies. No, what this bill did was target people who were outside the United States trying to target our soldiers or those of our allies. It was targeting individuals. Democrats said, well, this bill imposes draconian sanctions. Actually, if you look at the sanctions that this bill was proposing, it had been done, the same sorts of sanctions were done under both Obama and Biden 49 times. They said, oh, well, some companies could be held responsible. Again, no, this was about individuals. It was not about companies. And they said, well, the bill was poorly written, poorly drafted. Yet, it had passed, this same bill had passed the House of Representatives twice. The first time with 42 Democrats voting for it, the second time with 45 Democrats voting for it, including two of our colleagues that are in the chamber now that voted for it when they were in the House, except that when they came to the Senate, they voted against it. This was important legislation. Now, when the minority leader got up, he talked about the ICC and being anti-Semitic, and he's right. The UN in general is another one of those international organizations that's anti-Semitic. He says that he stands with Israel against the ICC. But his actions speak louder than words. When he had the opportunity, he stood on this floor earlier and said that Israel should have new elections to replace the prime minister. Well, folks, that action was in the same logic that the ICC is using when they indicted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It seems hypocritical that he could stand up here and say, I stand with Israel, yet they should have new elections, and somehow have the moral authority to defend Israel against the ICC. In blocking this bill, Democrats were voting to not protect our soldiers. They were voting to not stand up for our allies, not stand up for our sovereignty. They were not supporting specifically Israel. The appeasement first policy of the Biden administration is alive and well in the Democrats in the U.S. Senate today. Americans, take note. Mr. President, I yield back.